Thank you, JNU Academic and Dishi and all the other organizers for asking me to be part of this. Of course, I think I have been asked to speak here because I'm going to speak against the grain, and I hope that will be taken in a spirit of friendly conversation and debate and not trigger any resentments. Yeah. So, Kalyan Sanyal's book, in my opinion, is a grand interpretation of and synthesis of debates on capitalism and capitalist development. It speaks in the language of the contemporary and addresses certain immediate concerns around neoliberal capital, and that's one of the reasons why it has seen the reception that it has seen, and why it has had an influence over a range of, let us say, especially in the realm of campuses and university politics, a kind of, what should I say, a certain kind of interest in thinking about capitalism and contemporary capitalism and ways to really either challenge or circumvent it. And so, in a certain way, I would say it is an attempt to synthesize Marxism, of course, but the neo-Marxist variety of Marxism, and of course Foucault and post-colonialism. And in my opinion, one of the problems that I face, and I'll confess this very at the outset, is that these are paradigms which I feel cannot be synthesized, because they are based on very different conceptualizations of both the social and state-society relations. If there's time, I'll come back to what I mean. Now, Sanyal has many formulations. It's a rich book. Each chapter is like, has so many points, and it's so it's not possible to really talk about it in that way, as you saw even with Professor Bhattacharya's intervention. So I will just confine myself to three of his central formulations: primitive accumulation, need economy, and the emphasis on exclusion through the governmentalization of the developmental state. Okay? I'll concentrate on these, though there are issues with the conceptualization of the circuits of capital and also the characterization of mercantile and industrial capital, which one could have gone into, but in the interest of time I won't. Okay. Now, there is, of course, like a certain dismissal, and this is what actually kind of is the departure point both for post-colonial theory as well as the kind of tradition that Sanyal belongs to, which is distancing from something called orthodox Marxism in India and also the world. But there is very little engagement in the book with what is this orthodox Marxism that is being distanced itself from. And this is one of a very fundamental problem in terms of political praxis. Because if you are distancing yourself from something and you have a received wisdom of that, of what that is, without really going into, so I'm not talking about the transition debates in agriculture. I'm talking about the real political debates in Marxism that inform political praxis since the pre-independence period to the current times, and there have been many twists and turns. And there are, like the left movement in India is broad, it has many constituents, and historically how they have come about, what was their assessment of state-society relations, what was their basis of choosing a particular praxis or abandoning something. somehow this debate remains peripheral. It's almost taken as a granted that this is to be written off because they all only looked at formal, some kind of an idea of a formal working class. And I have a serious problem with this caricature of the political left movement in India. So this is I'm making my political position open in terms of where my critique is coming from. So there is also some mechanical reading I feel of Marx's writings, and this has important ramifications for my intervention. So let us start with the conceptual issues. The first is primitive accumulation. Now, I was very surprised when I read the book for the first time that Sanyal actually presents it as the prehistory of capital, okay, and capitalist accumulation. And though Marx himself actually in volume 3 of Capital quite elaborately explains that what he calls there is also a translation issue, as some of the people who've done the classes with me know, that from the German to the English, possibly what is more suitable is primary rather than primitive, because the sense of the primitive came in the English translation, okay? And which has led to this idea of prehistory and history, because though in part 8 Marx is talking about the genesis and the origin of capitalism, and looking at the various processes, historical social processes through which accumulation took place. But later in volume 3 he very cogently argues that capitalist accumulation does not mean the end of primary accumulation, and in fact both run through capitalism. And for Marx, the state becomes an important terrain of primary accumulation. And if you look at India today, and if you look at what is called global capitalism, the capitalism is inherently global. I don't know why. It is a system that is far more contaminating, to quote Ellen Maxine's word, than any other system that existed in the world today before, is something that makes the state, and at that Marx's time he looked at national debt and international debt, but today you can look at credit and international finance as two other terrains of primary accumulation. And he vociferously makes the point that both kinds of accumulation constitute capitalism. So this is one point of, let us say, departure for me. The second is that the engagement on the question of value, or rather surplus value, is more in line with classical political economy rather than Marx in Sanyal's book, because it is the two ways in which the surplus appears is in terms of surplus accumulation and in terms of surplus labor. Okay? But the question of what is the role of value creation in this process, which leads to these two kinds of surpluses that he deals with, is not very explicit in the text. Now, the other point is that I agree with the part on the critique of development economics in terms of the linear progressivism, the question of transition, the problems of the Lewis model, etc. But I don't think this is an economics audience who would be really interested in that. Though what is important to understand is that where my departure comes is where he strings Marx and later Marxists also into this developmental progressism, some kind of what he referred to as teleology. And this actually quite occludes what Marx himself argued as the dialectic of unity and struggle. A dialectical materialist approach will deny neither reality, neither unity, nor struggle in the human relation to nature. Instead, it will concentrate on, and here is that thing about economic reductionism, etc., that is attributed to Marx. I do not know if any of you are familiar with this, where Marx said, instead, will concentrate on the sensuous world, okay, as consisting of the total living sensuous activity of those living in it. This is far from economic reductionism. Okay. So reading Marx also, actually Marx is somebody who's like that elephant where people only read the parts that they think are relevant, and so often Marx gets reduced to what we want to make Marx out to be. Okay. So from this standpoint, of course, then comes the idea about the course of history and how people do not make their, as you know, that people do not make their own environments out of their own choosing, but they do work. So the question of agency is that certain things are given within which you have to build agency. So this then leads me to examine Marx's proposition for epoch-based or stagism as an approach. I think if there's one, Marx said he's not a Marxist, and if there's one thinker who did not have a stagist approach, it was Marx. Okay? So it is surprising that despite these references, Sanyal misses quite a bit of historical materialist reading of the transitions that Marx was talking about, because Marx never had a teleological view. He said, I'm concentrating on England because it was the first and the classic one, and to say, but even there he showed that the enclosures and the dispossession and the creation of the industrial working class, there were 4 centuries between the two. Okay? So it was not that today you got displaced from agriculture and tomorrow you got absorbed as the industrial proletariat. In fact, there is this lucid description of the treatment of the vagrants and the forced shipping to the white colonies, which Sanyal also talks about, but there is no reference to Marx in that. There's reference to others, but no reference to part 8 of Marx. Okay. And as well as what is considered to be the second wave of feudalism in Europe. Okay. In fact, as I teach capital twice every year, as some of you know in my courses, it is clear to me that the mode of production for Marx is not an economic idea. It is not, the basis of it is not economic. Marx stresses on social relations, and he argues that these are never pristine and not only survive, and these are messy, these survive in capitalism, and capitalism deploys in various ways different kinds of social relations that exist. In fact, recent work by Marxist feminists in India have shown new forms of bondage, like Jodi labor, Sumangali labor, which is a form of bonded labor, and other forms of bondage that populate the fastest growing sites of capital accumulation in India. Construction, what's going on here, which is why we can't hear ourselves, brick kilns, and the hosiery industry, which is geared towards export. These are not forms of independent wage labor. These are various forms of new forms of bondage that are emerging. So formality of contracts and security, if we read the condition of the working class in England or the later works of E.P. Thompson and others, what we find is that formality of contracts and the idea that capitalism functions on the basis of a formal relationship with labor is only a blip in the history of capitalism. It's like a blip in time, which lasts for a very short time in capitalism's 500-year-old history, more than 500-year-old history. And so the informal is the modality or the process of advance of capitalism through most of its history. There may be changes in its form, in its structure, etc. But it is not to, like, I do not know from where this idea has come. And I agree with Snehashish, this is because we look up to the West and to its theories and to its interpretations, and which has led us, and to its experience, which has led us to believe that it is formal. But even in Western economies, informality is something that has been there always. There is no point in history in any Western country where you had no existence of informality. Okay? Now, so the reason I'm stressing this is two things. One is, now I move on to the need economy, but before that I just want to ask, and so even though we say that we need to, and I'm not into false indigeneity and what should I say, Indic way of looking at things and stuff like that, okay? But the point is that post-colonial theory itself is the biggest imposition of the West, and from where does post-coloniality start is a question I want to put to all of you. If you can, I have hunted for it for 30 years of my life. Since it started, I was a student when all of this started. Today I'm just 12 years away from retirement and I still don't have an answer. What is the historicity of post-coloniality is my question. Okay, not its theory and not its justification. Okay. With that, I go into the question of the need economy. Okay. The need economy is in Sanyal, he himself says that he's giving a theoretical perspective to the vast literature, largely empirical, especially the ILO's role and the international organizations who suddenly discovered informality in the 1970s. And so there is, the informal sector, informality and non-capital social relations, mainly petty commodity production based on simple reproduction. This is what the terrain is. But then some red buttons get pressed in my brain. So the main question is that what is the relationship between the capitalist economy and the need economy? Okay? He says it is not Luxembourgian, okay? And suggests that the need economy exists on its own. Okay? It is not that the capitalist sector in the Luxembourgian sense needs an outside, which is the need economy. Okay? So, for example, in the more contemporary question, but also a question that spans the entire post-independence period or even the colonial period, where do we situate care workers, domestic workers, okay, in the need economy or the capitalist economy? Where would we situate them? Okay? In this duality, is there a space for these workers who constitute a large majority of what he calls the kind of people he's looking at to extend the need economy and its urban ramifications, but do they really feed into the need economy? Okay. I'm not going into elaboration because, I'm sure you get it. Okay. And does this not suggest a connection? A connection which would further become clear. So, for example, where do we situate home-based workers who assemble parts of sophisticated commodities like mobile phones, laptops, and such other commodities, okay, at home, okay, using own labor or family labor? So is piece wage not derived from time wage then, as Marx argued? What is wage then in the need economy? Because he says in micro enterprises there can be wage labor and there can be own employers' labor. So what is wage in the need economy? Is it different from what is wage in capitalism? Because for him, variable capital is wage goods, not wage. If you read the text very carefully. And so how do we understand then the understanding of variable capital which he deploys? Okay.
Extra 5 minutes after 20.
Okay. But I'm entitled to 2 more minutes given Snehashish's performance. So, but I'll finish. I'm almost done. Okay. See, I'm almost done. 5 minutes will be more than enough, actually. Okay. So,
if the audience is interested, we can be for any time.
So then, for example, how do we see increase of debt dependence through? So he has this. He has a entire assessment of seva, right? And how do we see the increase of debt dependence through bank credit to women SHG members, okay? Which is making Dalit and tribal women in Jharkhand increasingly vulnerable to the highs and lows of international finance, okay? Because there is a shift from what used to be subsistence to now earning cash because they have to pay the EMIs in cash, so they need cash, okay? And so the shift from non-institutional credit to institutional credit means that now there is this pressure to pay the EMIs, which then opens them up to the vagaries of international finance. So does the duality of the need economy and capitalist economy really capture these various kinds of, and I'm sure there are many others, I've just picked up a few which I thought. And so then I bring back some orthodox concepts, okay, to ask that, so is talking about capitalism enough in itself without referring to imperialism? Is imperialism dead? Okay. And if imperialism is dead, then what is post-colonial capitalism after the death of imperialism? And if imperialism is alive, then how does post-colonial capitalism address the question of imperialism? And so the tightly mutually exclusive spheres, to me, the duality and the binary, is a concern to me, is the way I would put it. And the idea that it is based on exclusion is also something that I find problematic, because in my opinion, adverse inclusion may provide an entry point to examine something else which is missing. So while there is this reference to the social, how the graded social hierarchy of caste, race, patriarchy and religion, these are not really part of the discourse, co-constitute class as what the sociologist Himani Banerjee says is the lived way of life, and undergirds the social relations of both capital and non-capital. So is the sphere of non-capital, what kind of power dynamics exist there? Okay? And what are the inherent relationships of power which cannot be tightly separated in these two spheres? Okay? And the last is the question of the state and the developmental state. And in this, it was a little disappointing, because while he was writing the book is the time when two very important critiques of the developmental state came out. One was by Ben Fine, and the other was by Bagchi and others. But most importantly, that the specific form of the state in capitalism is the nation state. The nation state and capitalism are coterminous. There is, and Marx himself, though people just, and he also I think does that, cite that line from the Communist Manifesto, which was after all supposed to be a bit of a propaganda literature written in 1846. But soon after that, in the next 7 or 8 years, Marx formulated something which is not referred to at all in understanding of Marxist theories of the state, which is that Marx said that there is no generalization possible for specific forms of the state as you cross borders. So the Indian state is different from the Pakistani state. The Pakistani state is different. He, of course, used Switzerland, the Prussian Empire, Hungary, etc. Okay? So nation state as conduit of preservation of oppressive social relations is, I think, something that needs to be looked at more, instead of this idea of developmentalist governmentalization through the welfare schemes, etc. Because for one, that India has never had a welfare state that covers what he calls the need economy. There has been no point in history where we have had such coverage. Okay? Welfare was very, very limited in India for a very brief period of time. But more importantly, that is it only that we look at state in terms of intervention? It's a more generic question. Or there are also these zones of non-intervention where the state doesn't step in, where the state doesn't want to abolish caste, it only wants to abolish untouchability or offenses based on casteism, but not caste itself, right? So there are the zones of this is just an example. So the zones of non-intervention are often more telling in terms of the constitution of the sphere that he's talking about. And so state-society relations and social relations with the zones of non-intervention of the nation state is something that I think could be a useful way, a lens to look at and reread Sanyal. I end with a counterfactual. The Industrial Disputes Act of 1947, when it was first passed, made all employer-employee relationships brought all employer-employee relationships directly under its purview. So if a domestic worker had a quarrel with her or was beaten up by her employer, could go to court and claim certain rights and entitlements based on being recognized as a worker. So who is the worker? Let's forget the working class. Who is the worker in India? Okay? So in 1947, just after independence, because of the pressure of what is considered today as orthodox Marxism or orthodox trade unionism, you had a conjuncture in history where the entire body of workers or the laboring people, okay, would have had the status of workers. Who opposed it? Ficky. And within a period of 9 years, this was reversed. And so informality, so only factory workers were and the factory of a certain size, but then given the status of workers, and everyone else was a non-worker in India. So informality has nothing to do with neoliberalism. Informality is about the state's intervention and non-intervention. And had it not been the case, so the counterfactual is, and if the worker struggle had won, and all the people we are talking about were recognized as workers, the real possibility was there, okay, and they were recognized for 9 years, then would the formulation of the need economy and welfareization still stand? Okay, I'll end here.